There is a man living in Northern California right now who owns 2 Super Bowl rings. He won those rings as a starting quarterback. He was named Most Valuable Player of one of those championship games. He led one of the most iconic franchises in professional football history to back-to-back world titles. And almost nobody remembers his name. He is not in the Hall of Fame. His jersey has never been retired. When television networks broadcast documentaries about the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, his face rarely appears. When fans debate the legends of the game, his name almost never enters the conversation. This man was the first overall pick in the NFL draft. He won the Heisman Trophy. He achieved things that 99% of quarterbacks only dream about. Then, he vanished. Not tragically, not dramatically, not in scandal or controversy. He simply faded into the background of football history, as if the universe decided that his story did not deserve to be told. His name is Jim Plunkett, and what happened to him is one of the greatest injustices in the history of professional sports. This is not just a football story. This is a story about a man who was beaten down, discarded, written off as finished, and then rose from the ashes to achieve immortal glory. A story about a franchise that was saved by a quarterback nobody else wanted. A story about what happens when the world decides to forget a hero. By the end of this video, you will be furious, you will be heartbroken, and you will never look at the NFL the same way again. December 1980, the Louisiana Superdome. 80,000 fans packed into a stadium that felt ready to explode. The Oakland Raiders were about to play the Philadelphia Eagles for the championship of professional football. And standing behind center for the Raiders was a 33-year-old quarterback who, just 18 months earlier, could not find a single team willing to let him throw a football. Jim Plunkett had been released, rejected, labeled as damaged goods. Every scout, every coach, every executive in the NFL had looked at him and seen the same thing: a broken man whose best days were far behind him. Now he was playing for the Super Bowl. But to understand how impossible this moment truly was, you need to travel back to the beginning, to a childhood so difficult that football was not a dream, it was survival. Jim Plunkett was born in San Jose, California in 1947. His parents were both blind, completely blind. They could not see their son's face. They could not watch him take his first steps. They could not witness any of the moments that parents treasure most. The family lived in poverty. Jim's father worked at a newsstand, selling papers and magazines by touch alone. His mother managed the household, despite navigating a world of permanent darkness. There was no money for luxuries, barely enough for necessities. Young Jim wore second-hand clothes and sometimes went to bed hungry. He learned early that the world was not going to hand him anything. But he also learned something else. He learned that obstacles were not excuses. He watched his blind parents wake up every single day and fight for their family's survival. He watched them refuse to surrender to circumstances that would have broken most people. That lesson would define everything that followed. Jim Plunkett discovered football as a teenager, and something remarkable happened. All the hardship, all the struggle, all the pain of his childhood transformed into fuel. He played with a desperation that coaches had never witnessed before. By the time he reached Stanford University, he was considered one of the most promising quarterbacks in the entire country. And in 1970, he delivered a season that etched his name into college football immortality. He won the Heisman Trophy, the most prestigious individual award in the sport. He was celebrated as the next great quarterback, the future of professional football, a guaranteed superstar. In 1971, the New England Patriots selected Jim Plunkett with the first overall pick in the NFL draft. Everything was falling into place. The kid who grew up poor, who watched his blind parents struggle just to survive, was about to become a millionaire, a star, a legend. At least, that was the plan. What happened in New England was nothing short of destruction. The Patriots were a bad team. Their offensive line was atrocious. Jim Plunkett would drop back to pass and immediately find himself surrounded by defenders. He was sacked constantly, brutally, mercilessly. In his first 3 seasons, Plunkett was knocked down over 100 times. His body absorbed punishment that would have ended most careers. His ribs were cracked, his shoulders were damaged. His confidence was systematically dismantled, one vicious hit at a time. But the physical damage was only part of the nightmare. The Patriots' organization was dysfunctional. Coaching changes came frequently, systems were installed and then abandoned. Plunkett never had the stability required to develop his immense potential. By 1975, the team that had invested a first overall pick in Jim Plunkett decided he was no longer worth the trouble. They traded him to the San Francisco 49ers for spare parts. San Francisco was supposed to be a fresh start, a homecoming. Jim was returning to the Bay Area, where he had starred at Stanford, where people still remembered his Heisman glory. Instead, it became another chapter of disappointment. The 49ers were rebuilding. They had a young quarterback named Steve DeBerg they wanted to develop. Jim Plunkett found himself on the bench, watching from the sideline, wondering if his career was slipping away entirely. In 1978, San Francisco released him. Just like that. 7 years after being the first overall pick, 5 years after winning the Heisman Trophy, Jim Plunkett was unemployed, unwanted, finished. Every team in the NFL could have signed him. Nobody called. Days passed, then weeks. The phone remained silent. The quarterback who was once celebrated as the future of football was now invisible, forgotten before he even turned 32 years old. Jim Plunkett began accepting that his career was over, that all the potential, all the promise, all the dreams had amounted to nothing but pain and disappointment. Then the Raiders called. Al Davis saw something that every other owner in professional football had missed. The legendary Raiders owner had built his franchise on collecting players that other teams had discarded. He believed that hungry men, desperate men, men with something to prove made the best football players. Jim Plunkett was the hungriest man in the entire league. Al Davis signed him as a backup quarterback. The role was simple: hold a clipboard, learn the system, provide insurance in case something happened to the starter. For 2 full seasons, that is exactly what Jim Plunkett did. He practiced hard, he studied film, he supported his teammates. He never complained about his reduced role, never demanded playing time, never caused any problems. Most people assumed his career was simply winding down peacefully, a former star accepting his fate as a forgotten backup. They could not have been more wrong. In 1980, starting quarterback Dan Pastorini suffered a broken leg early in the season. The Raiders, a team with legitimate Super Bowl aspirations, suddenly found themselves turning to a 33-year-old backup who had not started a game in years. The football world offered a collective shrug. The Raiders' season was over before it had truly begun. Jim Plunkett had other ideas. From the moment he stepped onto the field as the starter, something was different. The Raiders' offense, stagnant under Pastorini, suddenly came alive. Jim Plunkett was throwing passes with velocity and accuracy that nobody expected. He was reading defenses with the wisdom of a veteran who had seen every possible coverage. He was leading the huddle with quiet confidence that teammates immediately trusted. Week after week, the Raiders kept winning. Jim Plunkett kept delivering. The football world kept watching in disbelief.
This was not supposed to happen. Washed-up quarterbacks do not resurrect their careers at 33. Backup players do not lead teams to championships. The narrative was supposed to be retirement, not redemption. but Jim Plunkett had spent his entire life defying narratives. The Raiders finished the regular season with an 11-5 record. They entered the playoffs as a wild-card team, facing a brutal path that required winning 3 consecutive road games just to reach the Super Bowl. Nobody gave them a chance. First, they traveled to Cleveland and defeated the Browns. Then they went to San Diego and dismantled the Chargers. Finally, they crushed their division rivals in the AFC Championship game. Jim Plunkett was playing the best football of his entire life at the exact moment when everyone had written him off forever. The Super Bowl against Philadelphia was never close. The Raiders dominated from the opening whistle. Jim Plunkett threw for 261 yards and 3 touchdowns. His poise in the pocket was remarkable. His decision-making was flawless. He looked like the quarterback everyone once believed he could become, back when he was winning the Heisman at Stanford. When the final seconds ticked away, Oakland had won 27-10. Jim Plunkett was named Super Bowl Most Valuable Player. The man nobody wanted had just delivered a championship. Most stories would end there, the perfect Hollywood conclusion, the redemption complete, the hero vindicated. But Jim Plunkett was not finished. 3 years later, in 1983, he led the Raiders to another dominant season. This time, the team had moved to Los Angeles. This time, they were favored to win. This time, expectations were sky high. Jim Plunkett met every single one of them. In Super Bowl XVIII, the Raiders destroyed the Washington Redskins 38-9. It was one of the most lopsided championship games in NFL history. The Los Angeles Raiders looked invincible, and their quarterback orchestrated the entire demolition. 2 Super Bowl victories, 1 Super Bowl MVP, a career resurrection that defied every logical prediction. Jim Plunkett had done the impossible, twice. And then, slowly, quietly, without anyone really noticing, he began to disappear. Jim Plunkett retired after the 1986 season. There was no farewell tour, no emotional press conference, no national celebration of his achievements. He simply walked away. The years that followed were marked by a strange and persistent silence. When networks produced documentaries about great Raiders teams, Jim Plunkett received minimal screen time. When analysts debated the greatest quarterbacks of the era, his name was rarely mentioned. Most strangely of all, the Hall of Fame voters seemed to forget he existed entirely. Every year, the selection committee gathers to choose which players deserve immortality in Canton, Ohio. Every year, they debate careers and statistics in championships. And every year, Jim Plunkett is overlooked. 2 Super Bowl victories. 2. The same number as John Elway. The same number as Peyton Manning. The same number as Tom Brady had when voters were already calling him the greatest of all time. Jim Plunkett has more Super Bowl wins than Dan Marino, more than Aaron Rodgers, more than Brett Favre, and he is not in the Hall of Fame. The injustice is staggering when you actually examine it. This is a man who overcame poverty, who watched his blind parents struggle through unimaginable hardship, who was beaten down by the Patriots, discarded by the 49ers, and left for dead by the entire NFL. And he responded by winning 2 championships.
What more could he possibly have done? The answer, it seems, is simple. He needed to be louder. Jim Plunkett never sought attention. He never demanded credit. He never positioned himself as a superstar or cultivated a media persona that kept him in the public eye. He just played football, won championships, and went home. In a sport that rewards self-promotion and celebrates personalities, Jim Plunkett committed the unforgivable sin of being humble. He let his performance speak for itself, assuming that 2 Super Bowl rings would be loud enough. He was wrong. The Hall of Fame voters prefer players who dominated statistical categories. Jim Plunkett's numbers were good, but not spectacular. He played in an era that did not inflate passing statistics the way modern offenses do. His value was measured in victories, not yards. But victories apparently are not enough when nobody is telling your story. Today, Jim Plunkett is in his late 70s. He lives quietly in Northern California, not far from where he grew up poor, not far from Stanford where he won the Heisman, not far from the Bay Area that he saved twice as a professional quarterback. He rarely gives interviews. He almost never appears at public events. The spotlight that he avoided throughout his career continues to avoid him in return. And those 2 Super Bowl rings sit somewhere in his home, symbols of achievements that the football world has collectively decided to forget. The Raiders have retired jerseys for other players. They have honored other legends with ceremonies and tributes and permanent recognition. Jim Plunkett, the man who delivered 2 championships when nobody believed it was possible, receives no such honor. It is a travesty, an embarrassment, a stain on the franchise and on the sport itself. But here is what matters most. Jim Plunkett does not need the Hall of Fame to validate what he accomplished. He does not need his jersey retired to know that he saved a franchise. He does not need documentaries or debates or any external recognition to understand his own worth. He lived the story. He knows what he overcame. He carries those memories with him every single day. The blind parents who raised him in poverty, the brutal beatings he absorbed in New England, the rejection from San Francisco, the years spent holding a clipboard as a backup nobody believed in. And then the glory, the championships, the moment when the entire football world had to acknowledge that Jim Plunkett refused to stay down. They can forget his name. They can omit him from their lists and their debates and their Hall of Fame ballots, but they cannot take away what he achieved. The Raiders have seen many quarterbacks. Some became legends, some became cautionary tales, and one became the most forgotten champion in the history of professional football. Jim Plunkett saved a franchise. He won Super Bowls when winning seemed impossible. He proved that being discarded does not mean being defeated. And then he quietly vanished, leaving the rest of us to wonder why greatness sometimes goes unrecognized. If this story angered you, if it made you feel that Jim Plunkett deserves better, then subscribe to this channel. Join us as we continue telling the stories that the NFL would prefer to forget. Leave a comment demanding that Jim Plunkett receive the recognition he earned. Share this video until his name trends again. Let the world remember what the football establishment has tried to erase. Jim Plunkett was a champion. It is time we started treating him like one. Until next time, commitment to excellence.